In this series of videos I'm attempting to repair a couple of HP9100B calculators. In the previous videos in this series I've had a quick look at each of the two calculators and got both of them working up to a certain extent. This is the second of the two that we got running. It's not running properly, it does keep coming up with errors now and again, and in the previous video I had to carry out some basic repairs to the card reader. It was stuck halfway through a cycle and that's what was preventing the machine from booting up properly. So I've let us demonstrate this by running a card through this. You'll see that what happens is when we try to run the card reader, the display will go blank, and that's because it effectively stops all operations and focuses just on the card reader. And that's the mode it was in because the reader was stuck partway through a cycle. To get around this, what I was doing was lowering the mains voltage. Now that did not disrupt the regulated supply inside that we'll have a look at in another video. What it actually did was it disrupted the startup sequence, and it kind of took the machine out of its comfort zone, and because this has core memory, then it kind of caused the memory system to malfunction, and that bypassed the normal startup routine and got us into a state where it kind of skipped past the check it should normally carry out for the status of the card reader, and then it would run semi-normally. There are still some other faults with this. It does, I left it running with a self-test diagnostic program, and it does now and again come up with faults. And there are other issues with this particular machine as well that we'll look at as we go through the rebuild process. But the issue with the card reader was that the O-ring and pulley that drives the card out had been replaced at some point, and it hadn't been put back in properly. And it was very evident when we looked at it closely that it had been changed, and a viewer was kind enough to send me some photographs of his unit that had an original wheel in it. He did that after the repair, and but also I do have the other machine that still has the original wheel in it anyway. Now I have worked on quite a few of these in the past, and so as soon as I looked at the unit I realised that it had been tinkered with. So the obvious question is, well, why didn't I see that straight away when I was looking at the machine? And when I'm doing a series like this, I, as much as possible, try to record as I'm going, and so you kind of see what I see as I see it, and that hopefully makes the videos a bit more interesting. But just to clarify why I may sometimes seem to miss things that you can see clearly, you have a front row seat. I'm kind of sitting at the back of the room in to a certain extent, and I'll just demonstrate what I mean by that by using a second camera to show where I sit and what I can see. So if we leave this camera where it is, and we'll leave this set up here, I'll start up another camera and let you see what I normally see from my viewpoint. So this is the view I normally have. I'm looking past the tripod camera and the leads. I have to reach around and try not to knock the tripod or catch any of the leads, because if I do, then all of you go for a ride as the camera gets knocked around. And it is on I say on a tripod, so it does move around quite a bit if I bump into it. As I say, you'll have to forgive me if I look a bit cack-handed sometimes, but working around something like this is quite tricky, and it does make the operation a bit more difficult. So you have a first row seat, and I'm sitting at the back of the room. So as I say, that's why it might seem sometimes that I'm missing things that are obvious. Okay, so let's get on with the main purpose of this video, which is to completely dismantle this this calculator. Okay, well hopefully that goes some way to explain why sometimes I appear to be kind of reaching around things and may appear a bit cack-handed sometimes. I do have something in the way, and when I'm doing something that can sometimes be fairly technical or a small scale, then it can be quite difficult for me to see it. You have a front row seat, but I'm sitting at the back of the auditorium, so to speak. So hopefully you'll bear with me if I appear to be missing things that you can see quite clearly. Okay, so back to the task in hand, which is to completely dismantle this machine. I won't make any attempts to repair anything as we dismantle it. I may take some notes if I find anything that looks like it needs attention, but what we'll do is, once I have this stripped down to a bare chassis, we'll start reassembling, and I will go over some fairly in-depth explanations as to how all the parts in this work, how the system works. What would help the explanation if you're not familiar with this type of equipment is if you review my video series on the magnetic core memory, and also if you review my series on the transistor microprocessor. Also the series on the 9830A may help a bit, because the architecture in some ways is fairly similar to what's in here. It's very different in the implementation, but the general way the system is arranged is actually fairly similar. Okay, so I'll get this powered off and we'll start getting it apart. So we'll start dismantling this by removing the keyboard. So I'll just pull this forward. You can open up the top, and I'll just tilt the camera down so you can see a bit more clearly what I'm doing. So to remove the keyboard, there are 4 screws, one here, one here, one here, one here. There's only one screw in at the moment. I have already had the keyboard out, and there are only 2 screws in it when I received the unit anyway. And then the next thing we can do is lift it out of the way, and then we can simply unplug it. So we have a connector at the front here that pops out, and then this power connector, and this is just the mains switch connector, and then we can pop the keyboard to one side. Okay, I'll just move the camera again, and the next thing I'm going to remove is the card reader. So there are 3 screws that hold that in place. Now there is normally a P-clip that holds the cable to the chassis, but I removed that earlier when I was repairing the card reader, and I didn't refit it because I knew I was going to take this out. So that frees up the reader itself, and all we need to do then is pop the card out. It plugs into the motherboard. It's a bit of a tight squeeze down between the front plate and the card rack, and then we can remove this as an entire assembly. So I'll get this out of the way. Okay, next step is I'm going to remove the cards. Now if you're not familiar with this type of equipment, so if you're used to cards with ICs, that type of card is very difficult to damage through mishandling, but cards like this are very easy to damage, especially the ones that contain the core memory. It's very easy to smash one of the cores or rip the wires off, so you need to be very careful with this type of board. So what I tend to do is put them into a rack that holds them in a similar way to the way they're held in the motherboard, and also I put them into anti-static bags. So I'll do that off camera, but just be aware that you do need to be fairly careful when you're handling these boards. They are physically not as strong and robust as the boards with ICs on them. Also be aware that some of these cards look fairly similar, so if I pop this card out and then this one, notice that they look pretty much identical, and they are. They're the same, same design, same circuit, but you need to put them back in the same positions that you take them out, and they will vary slightly, and if you swap them over you'll probably find the machine won't work. In fact, if you've got a machine that isn't working, just make sure that they are in the correct locations. Somebody might have already swapped them. We can see here there is somebody's written on this already. So all we need to do now is remember that the one that has the writing on was on this side. So, and again, make sure you put them in the right way around. It's very difficult to put them in backwards because the connectors are offset, but even so, you still need to be quite careful with them. Okay, and next we'll pop out the RAM boards. So these are as a pair, so we need to be fairly careful to keep these together. Put these to one side, and then that just leaves the logic card. This is the one you need to be most careful with. This is very easy to damage. It's got some fairly delicate cores and some very thin wires, so you need to be very careful with this and make sure you don't damage these cores. And we'll look at all these cards in detail in future videos. Okay, so the next thing we can do is start to remove the components from the base or the components from the top, and to make it easier I'm going to take the components out of the top now, so I'll need to reposition the camera so you can see what I'm doing, and we can continue dismantling the unit. Okay, I'm going to start by removing this power supply board. Now these can be a bit tight and the plastic brackets are very easy to snap off, so be very careful with them. This one's a bit tight in there, so I just need to pop it out at the bottom. There we go. So that's the regulator card. And next I'll take out the deflection driver cards. That's these two cards next to the CRT. So we'll get those popped out. So once these are unplugged, you'll notice that at the back we have these two connections. Okay, but if you look on here, it does tell you what colour wires to put on there. And now we'll do the same with this one. So again, these tend to be quite tight. Okay, and that's that one out. So it tells you here what these are for as well. So we've got horizontal deflection, vertical deflection. You can tell them apart as well. They're pretty much an identical circuit in terms of what they do, but they operate in a slightly different way because of the relative timing differences. I'll explain how these operate in a future video, but you can tell them apart by the size of this big capacitor on the left. Now, because I'm completely dismantling this unit, the next easiest step is for me to actually remove the top cover. You can do that before you take the boards out, but it's easier with the boards out of the way because we need to remove these 6 screws at the back. And these leads are already loose, of course, so these will just lift out of the way. And then there's just the main power lead that goes down to the motherboard, which we can disconnect later. You can remove the supply and the CRT, etc. with this in place. If you're going to do that, the easiest way is to make up a wire that screws down to the chassis and up to the top cover, so you can tilt the cover further back. I think the service manual mentions a special chain that the service engineers used, but it's just something to allow you to tilt it further back without the top cover flopping all the way back, which will of course damage the power connector. But what I'm going to do now is take this top cover off. I'm going to do that off camera just because it's quite heavy and I don't want to damage this and potentially damage the tube. What I'm going to do is take out the 6 screws that are on the hinge, and then this will lift away. It'll still be connected, of course, because we've got the power cable going to the chassis, but I'll be able to take the P-clips off and just lift that out of the way with it still connected. But I'll get back on camera once I've done that and we'll have a look at the next step. Okay, I've removed the 6 screws that hold this hinge in place, and I've removed the 2 screws that hold the P-clips that secure the power cable in place. What I can now do is dismantle or finish dismantling the top cover. Notice I've now got this laying on its back, and so I've got it on a soft cloth so as not to damage the paintwork on the outside of the top cover. is heavy, and if you sort of drag it around the bench, then you will scratch it up. So it's well worth the extra few seconds just to put something underneath it rather than damaging all the paintwork. So the next thing I'm going to do is to remove the CRT bracket and the CRT. We'll get that out of the way and put it somewhere safe. Again, if you're not familiar with this, then it only goes in one way up, of course. You need to make sure you put it in the right way up. My main concern here is that, as you can see, the mounting bracket is broken. It's cracked all the way through. It is on the other unit as well, and this looks like a fairly fresh break, so I think this was done during transit. Doesn't seem to have damaged the tube, but again, you need to be very careful when you start releasing this to make sure you don't put any undue stress. In all honesty, the most fragile part of the CRT are the internals. They're all held in place with thin glass rods, and if you do drop these or bang them too hard, they will shatter, and then the internal parts move around. It's unlikely you'll damage the outer envelope. You can do, but it's quite resilient, but they're very easy to damage internally. So what I'm going to do now is just remove these two bolts, and then we can start looking at getting the entire CRT assembly out. I'm not going to take these all the way out. These are a clamp. I'm just going to slacken them, and then we'll take these two bolts out, and we can then lift the entire CRT out and unplug it. Okay, so this is now loose. The next step, there's two ways you can do this. You can remove the supply and the front bezel, or you can take the hinge bar off completely. If you're just doing a repair, you probably take the power supply and bezel off, but again, I'm stripping this down completely, so I am going to take this out of the way. The other way you can do this is this will now slide forward on the tube slightly, enough to clear this, but as I said, because I'm stripping this unit down completely, I'm just going to remove the hinge bar and get it out of the way. Okay, this will now lift upwards, and we should be able to lift the tube all the way out. As I said, being very careful here, and what we can now do is slacken the clamp all the way off, and then we should be able to separate this part of the clamp from this and separate it from the base. So we're very careful, we can pop this off. Now also you can do this with it in the machine, but the problem you have is as soon as you take these out, you notice this pops open, and then it's very difficult to get it back on properly. So it's best to do this way up. And also when we take this off, although it's pretty much impossible to put the tube on the wrong way, just to be absolutely certain, we'll put a mark on here. And I should now be able to unplug this from the base again. Okay, that's that removed. Now it's best not to unplug this unless you really need to. As I say, I'm stripping this right down, and don't just pull the connector. It's quite tight on here, and it's quite easy to separate the connector from the tube itself. So this is the tube type, and as I say, don't break this. The chances of getting a replacement are almost zero. I'm just looking for any sign of internal damage, and these are the glass rods I was talking about. They go up to the deflection plates that sit in this area, and okay, no sounds coming from it. If they're broken, normally you'll get this sort of kind of tinkling sound as you move it around, but be very careful with these. As I say, they are extremely difficult to get. It's well worth removing these. The front face gets extremely dirty. As with any CRT, the high voltage tends to attract dust, and so this will give us a chance to clean this and the front bezel. So I'll go and put this somewhere safe, and we'll continue. Okay, the tube is now somewhere safe, so we can get rid of the washers and nuts that dropped in. Just checking the connector here for any damage. Doesn't look too bad, but the contacts are fairly dirty. And the next step is to remove the power supply. So I'll get rid of the P-clips. I'm going to take the connectors all the way out. I've noticed there is some corrosion on some of these pins, and also I want to give the chassis a really good clean, so it's best to get these out of the way to do that. Okay, I'm going to leave this bolt here that appears to do nothing is for the printer mount. I'm going to leave that in place. They are adjusted to properly mount the printer, but we'll have a look at that when we look at the printer. So the next thing I want to do is unbolt the regulator pass transistor. Just a long bolt goes all the way through this. Okay, now that is corroded in by the feel of it. Okay, so this is corroded to the chassis, so I'll need to be very careful. I'll do this later. If I keep turning it, chances are the bolt will shear off, so I'll need to be very careful how I remove this, and I'll do that when I can see what I'm doing a bit more clearly. But normally it's just a case of trying to get some release agent down in there and just keep working it back and forth until it frees up. If you just keep putting more and more force on there, it's obviously going to shear something off. We've got an aluminium casting and a steel bolt, and they don't always play well together, so we'll need to look at that later on. Okay, so the next step is to get the power supply removed. Now the bolts down the side are missing, so I didn't take those out. They were missing when I received this, so I'll just take out the remaining bolts and we should be able to get this power supply removed. Okay, that's those 3 bolts loosened off. So basically these bolts go all the way through into the chassis, so now that these have been taken out and the 3, as I say, were already missing, so this should now lift out. There we go. And so we can tilt this back. You can see now that this is just captured under here, so we can pop this off, take these wires off. These are just held behind some cork gasket, and then we can remove this entirely. And there's a burn mark on this, which is a bit worrying, but we'll get this taken all the way out, and then we can have a look at it in more detail and see if there's any signs of damage. Okay, I've removed the bolt that was frozen in. It was just carefully working it back and forth with some release agent, and this is now free from the chassis, and everything else is unbolted. The last thing to come off is the connection to the error light bulb. These 2 connections were already disconnected. This housing was removed when I received this unit. I do have it, but it just wasn't fitted. And what we need to do now is just get these wires freed up. Now this wire is actually held behind these 2 pieces of cork. You could just pull it out, but if you do that you're probably going to tear the cork, and really you want this cork to be left in place. It's support for the CRT, but also we want the wire to be out of the way when we put it back in again. So rather than pull this out and tear the cork, what you can do is unplug the connector from the bulb. If you then start to slide this out, then when it gets to the part of the cable that doesn't have the outer sheath on it, you'll find that it will just work its way through and it will come out without damaging the cork. And then to put it back, you just do the opposite. If you just tear it out, then obviously it's not going to be held captive when you reassemble. What we can now do is actually pick this entire supply up, and this entire electronics loom will now come out of the top cover. So I'll just move the camera out of the way. I can't do it at the moment, the camera's in the way, but I'll lift this out, and the final step in dismantling this is just to take the few screws out of the front bezel, and that will then lift out, and that will be the top cover pretty much completely stripped down. So the last step in dismantling the top cover, I've taken out the screws that hold the front bezel in place. This will now just lift out, and I can strip this down further if I want to. I'm going to try and avoid doing that. These star washers that hold the metal plate to the plastic bezel, you've got to be very careful. They have a habit of snapping off the plastic mounting posts if you try and get them off, so it's best to leave them in place if you can get away with it. The bezel doesn't look too bad, so I'm going to polish up the front to get rid of these scratches. It's fairly badly scratched on the front, but the inside looks to be in fairly good condition, just needs a clean. So I can do that, and it should come back fairly nicely. It's in quite good condition and there are no pieces missing, which is of course extremely good. And that then just leaves the top cover. It's now pretty much empty apart from a bracket. This needs to be tightened in a second, clip putting on it, but I'll do that when we reassemble. And the rest of it looks to be in good condition, needs a clean, but other than that this is in quite nice cosmetic condition and doesn't appear to have any significant physical damage. So what we can do now is move on to the lower part of the chassis. Okay, so onto the bottom part of the machine. Now, underneath the motherboard is one of the most, for me anyway, most interesting parts of this machine in terms of the technology that HP developed back in the 1960s. It's not something we saw much of after that in the form that they had it here, although it is used in lots of other types of technology. We'll look at it in more detail later on, but for now I'm just going to unbolt this lower part of the chassis, and this entire assembly will come out in one piece. So I've removed the screws that hold this sub-chassis into the lower part of the case, and as with the, if you're familiar with the way that HP made these machines at the time, so machines like the plotter and printer, they've got a fairly similar structure, and this connector on the back is the only thing really that makes it difficult to get these out. But once you've got the screws out, what we should be able to do is slide this forward. Now you've got to be very careful because obviously it's quite an old board, and especially the board underneath the motherboard we really do not want to damage, so we need to be very careful. But we should be able to lift the front of this very slightly and slide the whole assembly forward, and then it should just lift out, which it does. So I'm going to just pop the camera out of the way for a minute, remove the chassis. I don't want to damage what's underneath this, and you'll see why when I turn it over. Okay, so this is what we have underneath once we flip this over, and it's really what's under this gold sheet that's the most astonishing part of this particular machine. I won't go into it right now, but this is the system ROM card, and it's almost unique in the way that it works, and it's absolutely fascinating, an amazing piece of technology, especially for the 1960s, and we will go into this and I'll explain how this works in quite a bit of detail. I'll do an entire video on just this center board, but we'll come back to that later on in a future video. For now I'm going to put this somewhere safe. I don't want to damage this. This is, to all intents and purposes, irreplaceable. There is absolutely no way we could reproduce this in the same way. If we ever wanted to reproduce the ROM board for this, we'd have to completely redesign it, and it would be a real shame to damage this technology. It is what to a large degree makes this machine fairly unique. So turning our attention back to the remaining parts that are still in the bottom part of the chassis, we have our cheat sheet, and we can quite easily remove that. We've got a top cover and then the sheet itself, and I'm just going to remove this and get it out of the way. Okay, so that can be put to one side. I can now get to the bolts that hold the feet in place. I will be replacing the feet. These are the pedestal feet that someone fitted to this, and the remaining part to get out is this. Now it should just lift out, but quite often you'll find that it's been glued in place, and this one is no exception. It's been glued down, and there's a bolt that holds this filter in place. There are several versions of this arrangement, but they're all, the wiring's fairly similar. It's just the physical arrangement changes. So I'm going to get this removed and then that will be the bottom part of the chassis completely dismantled apart from the feet. Okay, well, I finally managed to get this off. It had been bonded in place. Somebody had used epoxy or something to glue this down. Really isn't necessary. This is kind of held captive once the machine's bolted together, and this is fairly fragile plastic, and I didn't want to damage it, so that was a bit of a pain to get off. But once I got it off, I could unbolt the filter, a single bolt, and then I can lift this entire assembly out of the way, and that just leaves the feet to get off. But unfortunately these have been epoxied in place. There's epoxy on the thread, so I'm going to probably have to drill these out, but I will be replacing these feet anyway, so that's not a big issue. I just need to replace these with some proper feet for this unit. Okay, so that's the entire unit stripped down. Some of the parts we will strip down further. The power supply will need to go over, and the next step is I'll give the parts of the chassis a good clean, replace these feet, and then in the next video we can start looking at the electronics and slowly put this unit back together.